Today I'm going to talk about vintage era Omega Constellations. When it comes to vintage watches, there are few that I love as much as the Omega Constellation. There are several variations of the Omega Constellation that I love, but I especially love the ones with the pie pan dials. While I think the modern Omega Constellations are beautifully designed, I don't think they hold a candle to the older 1950s, 1960s era models. There are two 18-karat Omega Constellations that I've had my eye on for a while now, and the only reason I haven't pulled the trigger is because they're located in Germany. And I've had an experience purchasing a watch from overseas before, and just the process with getting them through customs back in the States, I personally have found it to be hella stressful, and so I try to avoid buying watches from overseas. But what I found is with specific models, especially the Omega Constellation 1950s, 1960s era watches, it's hard to find them in 18 karat gold stateside. And so most of the watches I've seen have been in Germany, actually. But I was recently on a flight and I was sitting next to a guy who had a watch on that looked like an Omega Constellation to me, but I was trying not to stare too hard at his watch, and at a certain point he actually fell asleep. And so when he fell asleep, I felt a little more comfortable, like leaning in a little more closely to look at his watch to see what he had, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that he had a steel 1950s, 1960s era Omega Constellation with the pie pan dial on a black leather strap. Towards the end of our flight, I made it a point to ask him about his watch, and he confirmed it was an early 1960s Omega Constellation, and I told him that I had my eye on one from Germany. He told him he'd purchased that piece from Germany, and I think at the time I was wearing my Oyster Perpetual, so he shouted me out. He gave me some props on my OP, and we talked about all things horology, and I told him I was a member of the New York Horological Society. He said he lived in LA, but he was a member of the New York Horological Society as well, and how cool it was to meet other people who loved timepieces. The pie pan signature design is still present in the modern model, but the new Constellations feel more like sports watches to me than dress watches. And whether or not the Omega Constellations intentionally were designed to look like dress watches in the 50s and 60s, that's definitely the feel that they have. I recall reading somewhere that the Omega Constellations from that period were created as direct competition to the Rolex Datejust, but they ended up paving their own lane and becoming their own special thing. I've seen some vintage Omega Constellations in steel for as cheap as around about $3,000. And the gold ones, they're never usually less than $7,000 or $8,000. They definitely have a smaller form factor than I prefer. Most of these watches in that era, they're like between 33 and 36 millimeters. I think most of the ones that I like the most are like 35 millimeters. But I think getting my hands on one and being able to wear them to formal events is going to be a beautiful thing. What do you think about the Omega Constellation? Whether it's the vintage era or the modern design? Let me know in the comments. Till next time.